Thank you.
It's recording.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna share my screen. So
yeah, we can see it.
See that. So
yeah,
the paradoxical U-shaped curve in the walking pilgrimage process. So I'm a Jesuit priest myself, and I'm a guide for walking pilgrimages. So I bring young people and older people on walking pilgrimages. A lot of them are in Ireland. Obviously, we have some great routes here, but also I'm a big fan of the Camino de Santiago. So a lot of my stories and anecdotes are about the Camino and just that model of walking in hostels and being in nature, etc. That's what I'm interested in. So first of all, pilgrimage is just a definition, and it's an outward journey of inner transformation. And I think that's really important. There's two dimensions. There's the physical journey, the actual walking, geographical displacement, but there's also the inner transformation. And, you know, the religious term is conversion, but there's this profound transformation, I think, that happens on a pilgrimage, that is the religious, the key to the religious experience. And I think that's what we have to preserve regardless. It's such a fundamental thing. I think that's what people are looking for. Then also just the definition of spirituality. So spirituality is just that way of connecting to the divine. So it's a way, it's a method, it's a technique of living out our relationship to the divine. And the word relationship there is key because it's a two-way process. There are things we can do. There are things we have to be open to. There's a certain amount of listening involved. And it's a two-way communication that happens, especially when you're on the road. I want to take St. Ignatius Loyola, who's from the Basque Country in Spain, just as a mystic and a pilgrim. I just want to take his method, if you like, because I think it's very helpful for us. It presents a bit of a fundamental model that we can use here. So just a little bit about his life story. First of all, he was originally a soldier, and he was in the army against the French in Pamplona. But he was essentially quite a vain, arrogant, proud. You know, he was brought up as a Catholic, but was quite disconnected from that in some ways, and was very impulsive and was prone to violence, apparently. So, you know, you have this one very strong character in one sense until he has this injury, and he was injured in the Battle of Pamplona in 1521, and a cannonball shattered his leg. You can see it there in this representation. His leg was shattered in multiple places. He was laid up for a number of months. And when he was laid up, he was reading different books out of desperation, really. And he was imagining different scenarios for himself, and eventually figured out that this was the divine, or this was God, whatever you want to call the transcendent, speaking to him. And he developed this new system based on inner experience. And I think this speaks especially to our generation today, to a postmodern generation. They want to know about experience. They don't want to know about rules or concepts or theory or doctrine. Tell me about the experience of God. I think that's an important connection here. So after that, he changed his life radically, and he went on the road as a pilgrim. And in fact, he calls himself the pilgrim. There's this autobiography that he wrote, and he calls himself the pilgrim. He refers to himself by that title. He crisscrosses Europe without anything, without any money, without any belongings, just purely living as a pilgrim, living on the providence, depending on others, you know, turning up in various places, being subject to hunger, the cold. In fact, he almost damaged himself quite severely with all the fast and the penances he was doing. Eventually he realized a little bit too extreme. But just as an interesting aside, as a Jesuit, we have to do that same experience as part of our training, to do a pilgrimage in Spain with no money for a month, just depend on providence, just to try to get us back into that experience of Ignatius. So eventually he has this really dramatic moment. This is in Montserrat in Spain, and he hands over his sword, and it's this symbolic handing over of his life, one type of lifestyle, to be born to a new lifestyle and to a new kind of following and to a new Lord and to a new kind of a new engagement, and that's a radically different one, obviously, than what he had before. So this is a bit of a model here of Ignatius's life story as a U-shaped curve, which is the model that I'm using. So you've got his old self, you've got that injury, which it renders him immobile, and I think that's really significant. This Jesuit psychologist says that it was the embodied nature of the injury that forced him to reassess everything, that he had to die to his old dream. You see this, the part of the bottom, there's a dying that goes on. Then there's this new discovery of there was something going on inside him, especially to do with moods and emotions and being moved in a certain direction, that he has this pilgrim lifestyle. He goes on the road, he gives up everything. And then you have this element of conversion and new life. So you can see really clearly there's a dying to the old self. There's a you going down into the bottom of the you, and then coming up again to this new life, new experience. There's a psychological, spiritual, integrated process that goes on throughout all of that. Just going to come back to that in a second. And he writes this book called The Spiritual Exercises, which is like, it's this classic kind of retreat. It's a Jesuit retreat, but it's been used all over the world for all sorts of people from all sorts of backgrounds. And it's a way of living the same experience. It's based on his experiences, fundamentally his pilgrim experiences. And it's a way of connecting, it's a way of reforming your life, if you like. The idea about it is, they call it the Ignatian workout, in the sense that there are things you can do which help you to tune in, to figure out where God is, to figure out what the divine is saying to you, and you can respond to that. But it's very much, it's a pilgrim spirituality, which is the key thing. It's a way of finding God wherever you are. God is always with us. The divine is always with us. And our job is to tune into that and to be led by that, to be able to move with that, to be free, to make good decisions, to try to live a good life, etc. So the key thing is this inner life, or this pilgrim spirituality, is what's happening within us. And that's it. That's obviously wherever we are, the reality of where we are. So we're always on the go, if you like, and our whole lives are a pilgrimage in one sense. Our whole lives are about trying to figure out what's God saying to us, what's the right thing to do, how should I live my life, how should I make good decisions. I just want to go back a second here to look at this classical model of spirituality. It comes from Dionysius in the 6th century, and he was from the Eastern Church, like the Greek Church, and he had the same shape model. There's a U-shaped curve. There's the purification step, this first step, which is this kind of ascetical stage, being separated from certain things that are unhealthy. He has an illumination step, which is the waking up to there's something else going on here. And then the third step, which is the high point, is the union with the divine, union with God, which is the transformed life, if you like. So that's interesting to find that way back there in the 6th century, because that is really crucial to the Ignatian model as well. So if I was to lay on top the Ignatius's 4 stages from the spiritual exercises, this is the 16th century now, it maps directly on. And in fact, there is a direct connection between the classical stages and between Ignatius's model. So here he divides it into 4 stages, or 4 weeks, he calls it. So the first is about realization or penance or atonement. So that's that same purification idea. There are certain things in my life that I'm not happy with, or not going well. There are difficulties. Think about it as a pilgrimage. There's discomfort, there's things that are not good. I meet myself on the road. Sometimes I'm not as generous, as compassionate as I thought. The second step is this reformation. So being made again, if you like, learning new things, new priorities. And there's a certain level of pain, asceticism associated with that, to be made again. And moving on to the third one, which is abandonment, or dying to self. This is in a sense of, as a Christian, the sense of the cross, or the passion of Christ. There's a giving of oneself for the sake of others, for a greater good. So then finally, the transformation, or the compassion, which is the 4th step. This transformed living in love, living in the light, living in the divine. The harmony of the union is present there. So again, it just maps on. Obviously, the U-shaped curve is quite a crude implement, and it's probably more like a spiral or more like a helix, but I think it serves as a model, a useful model in terms of how we can examine this process. So one of the big problems in, I think, pilgrimage in general and transformation and conversion is the problem of resistance. And I think you can see this on pilgrimage quite a bit, that the problem is what people bring to the pilgrimage, their expectations. For example, it's going to be easy, it's going to be comfortable. Wanting to be in control, I think, is one of the huge things that I've seen quite a bit on pilgrimage. People want to control everything. It's just a natural human instinct, but it doesn't work well in pilgrimage. One of the big things is letting go, trusting in providence, trusting that there will be a bed for you, trusting that people will be there will be food, there will be a bed at the end of the day, and a hot shower. But it's really difficult. It's easy to say that intellectually, it's easy to say that, but the pilgrimage, the Camino, makes you live that. You have to live it. So opening up your heart, this diagram represents, but there's all sorts of resistances. People, they want to protect themselves. They want to, a credit card becomes a barrier with other people, etc. All sorts of ways of controlling things, all sorts of kind of ego link stuff, selfishness, and the Camino is a brilliant embodied way that it breaks down our barriers eventually, but it's a painful process. But the goal is this Ignatian freedom, which is the freedom of the pilgrim. We often see this as the classic picture coming into Santiago, people celebrating, and it's that new freedom they've found. But they've been through a process on the road, and you have to appreciate the process they've been through, I think, in order to understand where they are. But it's that being free of these unhealthy attachments or addictions or wanting to control things or wanting to everything to revolve around themselves. So there's a huge letting go, and there's huge joy that comes from that, obviously, at the end of that process. So moving into my last few slides on how to support pilgrims on their Camino, their walk, their pilgrimage. So first of all, figuring out what stage they're at, obviously, is really important. So someone at the very beginning, the purification will be very different to someone towards the end. This question, what would help them to move on, I think, is the key thing. So some people need encouragement, some people need affirmation, some people need a bit of perspective, whatever. But this is, again, a very Ignatian thing. So listening and reflecting back is often more helpful than giving people directions or solutions. So I know a lot of hostels do this. They create an atmosphere, a group discussion at night where people talk about their experience without any judgment, without anybody kind of interfering or interpreting for them. People just talk about their experience. I think that is enormously helpful because it helps people process where they are. You also realize people are at different stages, and the fact that there is a process. So wanting to develop self-awareness and reflection, I think, are key elements. Knowing myself is a key thing, being able to reflect on my experience, look back to get perspective, to see what's important for me. And then finally, facilitating good decisions. Obviously, wanting to make good decisions consistently is what it's about. It has to come back into our lives, help us to live beyond the Camino. When we go back home, how we reintegrate into society, how we live this new awareness, and probably with new priorities. So then finally, just a conclusion. First of all, to understand that it is a process or a curve that you live through. That U-shaped curve, it's a rough model, but I think it represents well the process we go through. There's a purification process, there's a remaking, there's a insights, knowledge, and then there's a union, there's a joy that comes at the end of that. But people are at very different places on that curve, and there's a huge amount of individual difference, obviously, in this whole thing about how people cope with that. But I think helping people accordingly is key, to help people according to where they are, to what they need, what would be helpful. I think some of the Ignatian tools that are freely available here on the internet, ignatianspirituality.com, there's one called the review of the day, or the examine. It's a 15-minute review of the day at the end of the day, which is a really helpful way of reflecting on what's happening. One of the things that I do a huge amount of work with people is getting their expectations right. Like, you have to prepare for the Camino. You can't just show up, and certainly getting your head right, getting your spirituality, understanding that this is a process you're going to live through. There are difficult moments, there's some brilliant moments, there's some great supports, there's moments that you have to really hang in there. And then finally, some way of dealing with difficulty and suffering, I think, is key. I have a hunch, and it's just a hunch. A lot of people abandon the Camino because they don't understand about the process. Maybe they get injured, for example. Maybe they hit some difficulty and they can feel like, well, this is a disaster, it's all going wrong. Whereas in fact, it's just a normal part of the process. So I think understanding that can be really helpful of people continuing on the pilgrimage, but also getting the most out of it, getting the most out of what is a fantastic, really life-affirming experience. So that's my presentation. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a very, very interesting presentation. I don't know if we have any questions from some of the attendants or the audience. You mentioned one thing just meanwhile. So I had the chance to do some research on some of the points of the Camino Ignaciano and also St. James Way. And one of the things is that there are some points that are for both pilgrimage routes. But for example, here in Montserrat, where I am now, you can find pilgrims that are doing the Ignatian pilgrimage that they are ending because the last stage is Manresa, which is quite close, so they are ending. And those that are doing the Camino de Santiago, they are starting. Yeah. So it's interesting because it's what you were saying, they are at different stages of their pilgrimage, and it's interesting to see how they interact because they meet in the same hostel. So it's very,
That's right. I've done that pilgrimage myself there, the Camino Ignaciano, and at one point you're actually walking opposite the Camino de Santiago pilgrims. You're walking in the opposite direction, so it's really interesting. And in fact, one pilgrim stopped me and said, "You're going the wrong way." And I said, "I'm on another trail, you know." But it highlights that issue about, you know, there are different trails, and also people have different motivations, backgrounds, reasons for doing things. It's so important to kind of suspend judgment and to give people a chance to explain where they're coming from and to respect each other's, you know, priorities and pilgrimage goals, which can be very different, I think.
It's very interesting. So thank you. I don't know if we have more questions or some reflections that you want to share with us. No, neither from, I don't know if we have audience in the room, if there are any questions from the students in the room.
No.
Okay. Then
can we stop recording?
Yeah, please do.
Okay, thank you.